Hi, so in this video we'll be learning about neurons. Neurons are really interesting and they help us in so many ways. We will be covering the structure of a neuron, what is an action potential, and what occurs at the synapse. So let's get started. So here's a neuron. Let's go through each part of the neuron and find out what its specific function is. These here are the dendrites. They receive electrical signals from other neurons. So the dendrites really need the cell body to help find out if the electrical signal is strong enough for the signal to travel down the neuron. This is known as the all or nothing principle, which means a threshold needs to be met for the signal to travel down the neuron. This is the axon, which is what the electrical signal travels down. This is called an action potential. So if the threshold is met, an action potential occurs. The green part is myelin. Now this stuff is super handy because it increases the speed of the action potential. If you think about it, it's really important. For example, if we touch something that's really hot, we need to respond quickly. We can do this because of myelin sheath. So these here are the axon terminals. We're going to learn about them a little bit later. There are two important ions involved in an action potential. They are sodium and potassium. The movement of these ions across the membrane of the neuron changes the membrane's potential, which is needed for action potentials to occur. So this graph here demonstrates the changes in membrane potential and shows how an action potential occurs. At negative 70 millivolts, the membrane is at resting potential. Displayed in the blue is depolarization. Depolarization is when sodium ions rush into the cell, therefore making the inside of the membrane more positive. Here is when the action potential occurs. Repolarization is displayed here in the red. Repolarization occurs when potassium ions rush out of the cell, therefore making the membrane more negative. Hyperpolarization is demonstrated here in the green. Hyperpolarization is when too much potassium diffuses out of the cell. Now, because potassium is also a positive ion, when it moves out of the cell, it makes the inside of the membrane more negative. Therefore, if too much moves out, the membrane potential moves below resting potential. However, the resting potential is eventually restored. So this is another way of representing the graph that we just went through. At resting potential, there is more potassium inside the membrane and more sodium outside of the membrane. So here is where an action potential is taking place. That is because there are more positive ions on the inside of the membrane and more negative ions on the outside of the membrane. This means that sodium has rushed into the cell, therefore making the inside of the membrane more positive. This is demonstrating that depolarization occurs, therefore an action potential is now taking place in this section of the neuron. Notice that here the inside of the neuron is still negative and here is also still negative. That is because an action potential only takes place at one part of a neuron at a time and it moves in this direction. So next, this will become more positive. So now we're going to talk about what happens at the axon terminals. So this is the axon terminal. It's also part of the presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic membrane. This space here is the synaptic cleft. So the action potential has occurred and the signal has travelled from the dendrites through the cell body down the axon and now it's at the axon terminals. So everything before this stage has been electrically occurring. However, here in the axon, everything occurs chemically. So what we have here are neurotransmitters. Now they're inside a vesicle. Now I'm sure most of you have studied types of transport. Now when something is in a vesicle and it's moving out of the cell, what type of transport is it? I bet you guessed it, exocytosis. That's how neurotransmitters move out of the cell, via exocytosis. Now there's a few things that we're going to talk about now that help exocytosis occur in the axon terminal. Mitochondria, my favourite organelle because it provides us with energy. We need mitochondria to produce ATP via cellular respiration for exocytosis to occur. This is because exocytosis is an active type of transport and needs energy. Now, calcium provides an important role in this process. Calcium diffuses into the axon terminal, which prompts the neurotransmitters to move out. I like to think of it that when something moves into a space, it means that there's less room, so something else has to move out. In this case, calcium moves in and the neurotransmitters move out. So the neurotransmitters diffuse out of the axon across the synaptic cleft and binds to a receptor on the postsynaptic membrane. If there are any leftover neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, enzymes come along and break them down. So, now that the neurotransmitters have bound to the postsynaptic membrane, what happens now? Let's look at the big picture. So this here is the postsynaptic membrane. Hopefully you can see that the postsynaptic membrane is actually the dendrite of the next neuron. So if enough neurotransmitters bind to the postsynaptic membrane, the threshold of the next neuron may be met. Therefore, an action potential will occur again. This shows how one neuron stimulates another neuron. For example, in your brain, an action potential might occur in one neuron, which stimulates an action potential to occur in the next neuron, and so on and so on. So this example in your brain shows how one neuron can stimulate another neuron. So if we want to bring about a response, for example, if you touch a hot surface and you need to move your hand away, a motor neuron will be stimulated, which stimulates your muscles to contract. Therefore, you can move your hand away from the hot surface. Now let's recap. Today you should have learned about the structure of a neuron, an action potential, and what happens at the synapse. You should hopefully be familiar with words like dendrite, cell body, axon, myelin sheath, axon terminals, membrane potential, depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, mitochondria, calcium, neurotransmitters, exocytosis, synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic membrane. You should be able to talk about all these new and exciting words in relation to neurons. Hope you've learnt lots today. See you next time to learn something new that's all about the body.